Okay, and then as for our speaker today, we're super excited to have Dr. Zachary Kilpatrick join us. He's an associate professor of applied mathematics at CU Boulder. And so he works on a range of topics, from applied dynamic systems, neuroscience, collective behavior, which turns out to be like a big theme for this semester. So that's nice. It's going to tie in with all of the other talks. And for those that learn more about the mathematics, for those who would like to hear about the maths, his work kind of bridges so many cool topics from stochastic processes, PD, asymptotic analysis. So there's also a lot of fun maths and fun science together. And so Dr. Kilpatrick has a BA in history and also applied math. And he got from Rice University, a PhD from the University of Utah. I worked at Pittsburgh, at Houston, and is now at CU Boulder. And excitingly, next year we'll be at UVM for the whole year. And so if you find anything interesting, get to talk with Zachary after, because we'll be able to work together for the whole year. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, JG, and yeah, thanks also to Laurent and Chris for kind of hosting me for these few days. As Jean-Gabriel mentioned, I'll be here all next year as a visitor on sabbatical. So if you want to talk to me, today, or I'll be around tomorrow as well. I'm up in E405, I guess Juniper's office temporarily. And in general, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this project, which is focused on collective decision-making and Bayesian inference models of social information sharing and evidence accumulation. But this is just one part of my research. I've also worked on dynamical models of honeybee swarming. My background actually is in spatiotemporal pattern formation in neural networks. And we have several projects also on human decision-making in individuals and sort of large cohort studies. So if you want to hear more about that, happy to chat about that. I guess this is just the first foray into conversations with you all, and looking forward to many more over the next year. So let me start out by motivating this talk and saying that this is primarily just going to be a mathematical modeling talk, and I want to tell you about some kind of conceptual lessons that we learned about the effects that social information sharing can have on individual decisions in the context of groups that are sort of acting like Bayesian rational agents. And this is going to be pretty equation light. But if you want to get into the dirty details, happy to do that offline, or I think I have some extra slides in there at the end. So, what am I talking about today? I really want to think about how to formalize the process of kind of combining private information accumulation that individuals may do over time, along with reasoned and sort of rational social information sharing, which people may or may not do, but which does come out of trying to build sort of Bayesian agent type models of information sharing. And sometimes I think people do things like this. So it looks like I'm kind of frozen. Okay, let's get going. So these folks worked on this project. So Simon was a PhD student at University of Houston, primarily advised by my collaborator Chris Josic, but also I sat in on these meetings as well, and that really sort of precipitated this larger project that I'll talk about today. Will also faculty in math at University of Houston. Megan is finishing up her PhD right now, and Bhargav Karamchet is now a tenure track faculty at Florida State, but he was a postdoc that worked with us on some of the stochastic analysis of these Bayesian models. And Benji Lindner is at Humboldt. He is first passage time extraordinaire. And if I get to it, I'll talk a little bit about the last project of my PhD student, Subeksha, who's actually graduating in a month. She's defending in a month, which takes the models that I'll talk about today and pulls them into thinking about how primates accumulate information about food availability and share that with their group mates when they're sort of foraging from trees, so sort of a social patch foraging, patch departure problems. Okay, so what motivates what I'll talk about today is the fact that animals largely make decisions based both on their, proximal observations of their environment that they do personally. Okay, so these are actually rock-stealing penguins that live in Antarctica. They make nests out of these rocks on this island, and this is like the only kind of rock that I guess they can make nests out of. And the way that they get them is they steal them from other individuals in their colony. So based on the temperature, their sort of personal physiological conditions, and also what they see their colony mates doing, they decide whether to jump off their own nest and try and go steal a rock from one of their neighbors. And actually they can sort of operate in packs and almost like a gang or a mob or something like that, and move from one patch of the colony to the other, and these little sort of factions of rock stealers form. Bees make decisions about where to build their nests and also where to forage nests, both based on the individual scouting that bees go out and do. So bees will go out themselves and look around for patches of flowers, but they'll also come back to the nest and hear messages from their colony mates about where they went and foraged before. So not only are they doing their own sort of private research on the availability of foraging sites out in the wild, they're getting information from other folks as well. Okay. Trees, okay, do this as well. They sense insults, like these parasitic caterpillars. Temperature changes, sort of changes the wind as well. But they also send chemical messages from each other to sort of warn each other of danger. So even trees have to integrate both sort of temporal information that they sort of collect on their own, and also social information that they glean from their neighbors. Okay, and of course, people do this in many forms as well. I guess this is just sort of a stock picture of stockbrokers, reading the Financial Times and deciding, what to buy or sell. That's it. Okay. So I probably don't have to convince this group that people, combine private and social information, but this is just sort of the context of this talk today. So what my models that we'll talk about today do is they sort of break down the inflow of sort of temporally varying, noisy sort of private information, whether that's, personal research or just sort of sensory inputs that an animal might have, apart from the social information that individuals might get, right? So you may hear sort of vocalizations from your neighbors about dangers. You may sniff the pheromone trails that your neighbors have drawn out. You may, hear the opinions of other individuals on social media. You may see other flashes of fireflies in your group and decide whether or not you want to flash along with them as well. Okay, so in general, what we're going to sort of build up today are Bayesian models of this combination of private information accumulation and social information sharing. And in order to start that process, I'm going to talk about how that works for one individual, okay, to start with, based on what's called the log likelihood ratio update, which you may have heard of before if you've, taught or taken a course on sort of Bayesian statistics. And then we'll talk about what happens when we incorporate sort of information passing in the context of small networks of individuals. Okay, that's one easy case, is just sort of pairs of Bayesian individuals. Okay, and then the other easy case is a very, very, very large group of fully connected individuals sharing information as well. And we'll talk about what happens when just sort of one of them makes a decision and how that can sort of propagate through the rest of the group. Okay, so the title of this talk sort of borrows from something that we found out when we studied this model but we sort of broke the symmetry of all of the individuals having the same criterion for decisions. We found that when you have a combination of individuals that don't require very much information to make a decision about what they want to do, and then some other individuals that do require a lot of information about what they want to do, then that group, that heterogeneous group of individuals, tends to make decisions more robustly and efficiently than a homogeneously distributed group. Okay, so that's what I'll sort of build to throughout the talk. If I get to it, okay, I'll talk about how correlations and sort of private information can decrease the accuracy of deciders. So if you think, about people maybe trying to decide on what candidate they're going to vote for or something like that, multiple individuals are going to watch the same TV program or read the same news article, right? So they're going to glean different bits of information out of that article, okay? But they're going to get some correlated information because they're drawing from the same source, okay? And so when we consider those correlations in our model, which is sort of the next step up of assuming all sort of observations are independent, we'll talk about the effect that has on accuracy if we get time. And then I'll talk about this sort of patch foraging model that builds on this at the end, okay? So let me take a breath and say, please just interrupt me freely throughout this talk. I would much rather have a dialogue than get through all my slides. So, and, I just want to make sure that, everybody feels like they're getting all their questions answered. Okay. All right, so I can go on. So not surprisingly, the indefatigable Alan Turing has something to do with this talk. So what I'll start with is talking about a model for just making decisions between one of two options based on a sequence of noisy observations, okay? So let's take kind of the textbook example of deciding which of two biased coins is being flipped based on the sequence of, heads or tails outcomes that you see. Okay, and this actually goes back to Alan Turing and even some statisticians before him, but Alan Turing used this to decode the Nazis' Enigma machine during World War II at Bletchley Park. So this textbook example, though, basically says, let's say we have two coins. One of them is heads bias, where heads come up with probability P, and another is tails bias, where heads come up with probability 1 minus P. Okay, if we randomly select a coin and we pick either coin with sort of equal probability, and we start flipping it, okay, and we see heads, let's say, then the probability that we would have seen heads if it was the heads bias coin is P. The probability we would have seen heads if it was the tails bias coin is 1 minus P. And the log of the ratio between these two numbers is given by this, and we can just call that some number rho here, okay? The log likelihood ratio corresponding to a tails outcome would just be the negative of that, because we just, flip the ratio here, based on the symmetry that we've created in the model, is sort of for convenience, okay? But the idea is that because of the independence of a sequence of these observations, okay, and an application of Bayes' rule, each subsequent flip of the coin that we get, okay, adds one of these two following numbers to what we call the log likelihood ratio, depending on whether it's heads or tails, okay? And this single number, this single sort of stochastically evolving number, quantifies how sure we are that we're flipping the heads bias coin or the tails bias coin. If it gets really positive, then we're more and more sure that we're flipping the heads bias coin. If it gets more and more negative, we're more and more sure that we're flipping the tails bias coin. Okay?
And
yes.
P is known here?
Yeah, the P is assumed to be known. So you can build a model where you have to infer the P as well, but then you have another sort of hierarchical layer. Yeah. Okay. So this is an example of a binary decision based on a sequence of just binary observations. And the question that Wald answered in the 40s is kind of, what's the best way to decide when to make a decision about which of these coins you're flipping? And it turns out if you value accuracy and you value basically not taking forever to do this task, pretty much the best way to do this is to set some threshold on this statistic, okay? And when that number gets above some threshold, theta plus, you decide that you're flipping the heads bias coin. If it gets below some number, theta minus, which is probably going to be a negative number, you pick the tails bias coin. So here's an example of a trajectory like that. I flipped heads twice, I flipped tails 3 times, heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, heads, heads. And eventually I get to the point where I flip 3 more heads than tails, and I have enough information that I decide I'm going to go ahead and decide that I'm flipping the heads bias coin. Okay. So now I've created kind of something like an optimal policy for making binary decisions. Okay. That's called the log likelihood ratio update. Okay. Or the sequential probability ratio update. Okay. And we can go a step further, okay, and say in general, I'm probably in nature not always just getting, big chunks of information at once. I may get, little bits, little streams of information very rapidly, okay? If I'm looking outside and I'm trying to decide which way the wind's blowing, and let's say I'm looking at, leaves falling off of a tree, I see one leaf going this way, I see another leaf going that way, I see another leaf going that way. Okay, each of those gives me a little bit of information about which direction the wind is blowing. And let's say I want to know whether it's blowing east or west, because I'm going to decide, whether I can go sail my boat or not, right? So, so let's say there's 2 options again. This is a binary choice. And depending on which of these options is true, my observations would be drawn from one of these 2 distributions, which we'll call the likelihood function, okay? But there's some probability of drawing some observation psi n given that option H plus or H minus is true, okay? And then each of these, let's, just for illustrative purposes, it's Gaussian, it has some mean, mu plus or mu minus, okay? Now, if I get these observations sort of infinitely quickly, okay, and they're each sort of infinitesimally weak, okay, we can derive some sort of a continuum limit, okay? And this model has been used a lot in sort of sensory motor tasks in neuroscience, sort of visual discrimination tasks, just like the sort of leaf experiment that I'm talking about, except it's with monkeys looking at randomly moving movies of dots, okay? People give talks on this to death, but I won't go into detail on that today. But the idea essentially is that instead of just doing a discrete update, okay, I can take the continuum limit of this using something called the functional central limit theorem. And the model that we arrive at is what's called the drift-diffusion model. It's some stochastic differential equation where m corresponds to kind of the signal to noise ratio, which corresponds to sort of how far apart these likelihood functions are. And each of these increments is just randomly drawn from this Wiener process here. And the way this looks, if you simulate it, is this dark blue line here. There's some underlying drift that corresponds to sort of how strong the evidence is in this model. And then there's sort of noise that rides on top of it according to this Wiener process. And again, if we set up some sort of thresholds to decide whether we'll decide, whether this is the distribution that's being drawn from, or this is the distribution that's being drawn from, okay? And we set these thresholds, and the farther apart we put these thresholds, the more accurate but slower decision we'll make. And the closer together we put these thresholds, the quicker but less accurate decision we'll make, okay? And there's for any given task, there's some sweet spot where you sort of adequately trade off speed and accuracy, okay, to the best of your ability, okay? And we've looked at this models like this in the context of sort of inference of the frequency of rare events. It's a project with my postdoc. And I have a PhD student, a 4th year PhD student, Nick. And we've looked at, when you introduce dynamics into which of these choices is true, or, the sort of context, maybe even the underlying evidence streams that you're getting out of these different choices, how to sort of set these policies, how to set these thresholds. They're not always flat. Sometimes they can be sort of time varying, okay? And if you want to talk more about that, happy to talk more about that offline, okay? But for the time being, I just want to point to that this particular model right here is what comes out if you consider sort of a continuum limit of this Bayesian inferential update type equation that we talked about before, okay? So that's for a single observer. What happens when we start mixing individuals together? Okay, so let's say I have, a couple or 3 individuals. They're all accumulating sort of their own independent streams of information, but they're all drawn from the same sort of underlying ground truth. They're all sort of drawn from the same likelihood function. whatever is true is sort of true for all of them. Okay, but they get a noisy sample of that, and so they develop sort of different beliefs over time. Okay, now this is, a kind of an old problem. People haven't necessarily really mixed together the idea of stochastic time varying evidence and sort of social information sharing before. Okay, but the models we have sort of come across that look at sort of social information sharing in this sense. I'm just giving a sample of them. You could probably come up with a much longer list of this than me. Okay, this problem, it goes way back to Condorcet, who looked at this in the context of just jurors that arrive at a jury already with some bias in favor of voting, guilty or not guilty, and you just pool their opinions, and the output is some, sort of majority opinion, agreeing guilty or not guilty in a certain case. In that case, they're not really necessarily in Condorcet's model accumulating any evidence. Okay, de Groot looked at this sort of diffusive opinion sharing model, where again individuals arrive on the scene already with some opinion and then just share it with their neighbors according to some weight matrix. And then these authors have also looked at sort of opinion sharing, but doing it in a sort of rational, careful, and even Bayesian way, but not incorporating sort of stochastic time varying inference into the equation. Okay, so what we want to do is sort of take these past papers on sort of opinion sharing and incorporate this component of sort of stochastic evidence accumulation into the equation. Okay, so actually, folks that did this a little bit before us are Cagenalp and Doron. Okay, they essentially took that drift diffusion model that I wrote down before, and they said, okay, well, what if you have individuals sort of accumulating evidence in order to make a decision, and one of them shares that with their neighbor when they make a decision. Okay, so in this case, the blue decider, okay, is accumulating evidence. They accumulate evidence in favor of the minus decision. When they do, they tell their neighbor, and that kicks their neighbor's belief by some amount, actually in this case enough for their neighbor to make a decision. Okay, in this case, the blue individual has accumulated enough evidence to make this decision. That kicks their neighbor's belief by this amount. Okay, you might call this sort of a pulsatile coupling model, but not enough for them to make a decision, but eventually they do make a decision in that direction and are biased by the neighbors when doing so. Okay, so this is one sort of step towards information sharing, but this model wasn't really derived based on these sort of principal Bayesian evidence updates. It was just basically add a kick to the drift diffusion model that we wrote down before. Okay, but the idea is that there's some background truth. Both of the individuals are accumulating evidence. They share their decision, or maybe they even share their beliefs with each other. And at the end of the day, they both have some variable that represents their belief in the direction of one or in the direction of one of the options. Okay, and in this case, that variable is threshold in order to trigger a decision. Okay, so in general, right, you could probably come up with a lot of cases where individuals share just their decisions, but not necessarily the evidence that they use to acquire that decision. So you might say, well, why don't these drift diffusion processes, why don't you couple them almost like diffusively in some way, okay, where the individuals are sharing exactly what their belief is online, okay, and so they both end up with kind of the same belief, and they both always sort of hit the threshold together. Well, there's a lot of reasons why you might not do that, okay? There may be a cost to sharing your reasoning associated with your decision-making process, okay? You may make yourself vulnerable. So animals that are worried about being attacked by a predator, they're not going to make vocalizations just all the time, but they may wait until they think a predator is very close to emit a vocalization, okay? On Twitter or something like that, you may only have so much space to just share what your belief is and not necessarily your reasoning, right? So you may only have so much time to sort of post a response to somebody else's opinion here, right? And maybe only a sentence, and it would take pages and pages to explain the reasoning behind why you made that decision, okay? So these are some pictures of some cute prairie dogs by my house in Louisville, Colorado. Okay, and in addition, the honeybees sort of when they share information about what home site they want their neighbors to forage from to go to, or where they want their neighbors to go forage, they may do that by just telling them where that foraging site is. They're not going to tell them the details of how they found that foraging site, why they think that foraging site is better than the foraging site that their neighbors are thinking of. Okay, so there's a lot of instances in nature where individuals just share their opinions with each other, and until they arrive at that decision, okay, they don't share any information with each other. So that's the kind of models that we're sort of thinking about today. Okay. So what happens now in Bayesian models when we think about individuals that accumulate evidence towards one of two decisions, okay, one of two options, okay, and then only share that decision, okay, with their neighbor, or they share with their neighbor, I haven't made a decision yet, I'm still undecided, okay? What's the best a Bayesian agent can do with that information? So in order to examine that, let's look at the simplest possible case of just a pair of individuals, okay, sharing unidirectional. So one individual is going to accumulate information towards the decision, okay, and either share that decision or share that they haven't made a decision with agent number two, and then agent number two is actually not going to share any information with agent one, okay? Just to keep it simple, just to look at how the mathematics of this unfolds, okay? So they're accumulating noisy evidence, like the processes that we've talked about before, between some binary underlying truth, okay? One of two binary underlying truths, okay? They're each drawing independent and noisy informations about the sort of underlying truth of the environment, okay? But they don't, necessarily draw the exact same observations, okay? But they're drawn from the same statistical distribution, okay? They don't share observations, okay? But, agent two observes agent one's immutable decision. So in this model, we'll assume one of them makes a decision. They can't go back on that decision later once they sort of learn more, okay? And so this variable that comes out of agent one is either a 1 if they've decided H plus, a minus if they've decided H minus, or a 0 if they decided nothing at this point in time, okay? And for now, we'll assume there are likelihood functions and thresholds, okay? So how much information is provided by a decision in this case, okay? And although these decisions are objective, just for illustrative purposes, let's consider political decisions just because it makes for a nice story, okay? So let's say that, you're watching one of your friends on Twitter to see who they say they're going to vote for in the next election for some particular office, okay? If you knew that that friend was sort of unbiased to begin with, then they would need as much evidence to vote for a Republican candidate as for a Democrat candidate, okay? So let's say they read some news articles, they watched some TV, they looked at, friends on social media, and then maybe they read some biography about a candidate and eventually decided that they would vote for the Democratic candidate, okay? If you knew their initial bias and you knew, sort of their criterion for making a decision, you would say, once I see them make this decision, I know that their log likelihood ratio basically incremented by this amount in order to make that decision. So that's how much information you glean from their decision. But if you knew that they were Republican biased to start with, and it turned out they sort of, read this same news article, okay, to start with, then actually a very small increment of information would allow them to, make that Republican vote choice, because they really didn't need much information to begin with in order to make that choice, okay? So knowing the biases of individuals and their criterion for making decisions, okay, gives you complete information about how much evidence they need to make either of these decisions, okay? So I think one important lesson here is that not that people that we disagree with their opinions are worthless, okay? But if you knew somehow how to calibrate your knowledge of their biases okay, you could glean information from them about how much evidence they were using in order to make their decision, okay? And by the same token, if your friend was Democrat biased, you knew that they wouldn't really need very much information to vote for a Democrat, okay? So, you know, they read some news article, maybe that favors the Republican, they watch some TV show that favors the Democrat, and they only had to, you know, move across this amount of evidence space in order to make a decision, okay? So that's the idea. So if this is what agent 2 sees from agent 1, essentially, they learn from their decision, basically their LLR increment in order to make that decision when they see their decision, okay? So agent 2 would have their own private evidence accumulation process. And what we showed in this paper is that you can just add to that the social information that they get from their neighbor. That's just what falls out of sort of turning the Bayesian crank on this. And, you know, in the unbiased case, then they get, you know, this amount of information. In the Republican biased case, they get this amount of information. In the Democrat biased case, you know, they get some smaller amount of information too, okay? Now, that's in the case of decisions, okay? But what about before they even made a decision? Even though they're not sharing information with their neighbors, okay, does agent 1 provide some information, okay, indirectly to agent 2 by being undecided? It turns out in the case where agent 1 is unbiased, okay, you know that if they really just got a little bit of information in favor of the Democratic candidate, they would go ahead and decide they were going to go vote for the Democrat, and they would trumpet that, you know, on social media or something like that, okay? But if they remain undecided, okay, then that suggests that they've gotten evidence in favor of the other option, which is sort of farther away. And so what we learned, okay, by working through this, and actually it comes down to sort of first passage time processes and survival probabilities, okay? I'm happy to go into the guts of that if you want, okay? That at some intermediate time, if they still haven't made a decision, they probably should have chosen the closer option now. And because they haven't, that actually provides agent 2 evidence in favor of the less favorable option, okay? The harder to get to option, okay? So that's the idea here. So heterogeneity in the thresholds of agents or biases in agents' initial beliefs can provide information even in the context of their indecisions, okay? So we thought that was interesting, and it was a little bit unexpected, okay? Now, I've done the super easy case of just one agent making a decision and they're, you know, sharing it with their neighbor. What happens when you have 2 of these agents and both of them share their decision states with each other? So you have a recurrent network. It turns out it's a real mess, okay, if they have asymmetric thresholds, because essentially, after each of them makes an observation, they look at each other and say, have you decided yet? No. Have you decided yet? No. Okay, well, because you haven't decided, that's going to update my belief, okay? And now let's look at each other again. Have you decided yet? No. Have you decided yet? No. Okay. Well, I know that you updated based on the increment, the LLR increment that you got out of me from that. Let's update again. And so between each observation, the Bayesian agents have to keep on updating, okay? And what we were able to show is that eventually this process converges and then they all make another decision. But it reminds me a little bit of Count Vizzini, okay, from Princess Bride, okay? This sort of recurrent belief updating where he looks at Dread Pirate Roberts and he says, I know what you would have done, but I know that you are thinking about me thinking about what you would have done, okay? And I know that you're thinking about that too. And he goes through this sort of recurrent, almost like a sort of a common knowledge recurrence argument until he eventually arrives at a decision, which ends up being wrong because he didn't know there was a third option that Dread Pirate Roberts took in this case, okay? Another way we sort of describe this is as kind of echo cancellation, okay? And the conceptual lesson that we learned from this, okay, is that if you don't account for the fact that your neighbor is using information from you to update their own belief, then you will end up double counting information, okay, that they got from you, okay? So if I tell my friend something and they make a decision based on that, and then I say, oh, isn't that interesting? That's my friend's opinion on that. That really consolidates my own opinion based on that. But part of the reason they think that is because I shared some information with them, okay? Now, surely people don't do this very well, okay? But this told us something useful about maybe what Bayesian rational agents can do that people don't do so well. So breaking this sort of tells us one way that people may deviate from Bayesian rational agents, okay? And we can extend the analysis to chains and sort of large networks, but as you would imagine, it gets kind of messy, and the conceptual lessons get sort of watered down in that case. But if you want to look at more details, it's in the Simon Dynamical Systems paper. Okay, so I'll take another breath again and see if there's any questions, anything on cyberspace.
Peter Dodds said see also Rick Sanchez versus Istotron. Hi, Istotron.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to look it up.
I had this is Chris Danforth. I had one question about you're probably going to get into this, but there are lots of reasons to have friendships, and one of them might be to get information you necessarily will disagree with. So, like in The Big Short, where the Michael Scott's character's like, whatever that guy is buying, I want to short it. So I wouldn't tell my friends this, but there are some friends I go to for opinions that I will definitely do the opposite of. And I'm wondering if you looked into, what heterogeneity in trust in this sort of a model produces.
Yeah, so I think what happens there is that you have individuals that just have different likelihood functions. So the exact same piece of evidence, okay, it could be more probable in one person's likelihood function than another. Like if I see a particular pundit talking about something, okay, that will tip my belief in the exact opposite direction of somebody else who filters it in a very different way. So I think we can incorporate those things into our models, and it really has to do with the initial assumptions that we're making in terms of the observations that you would expect to get if an underlying choice is the correct one. So that's one way to address it, but there's probably others. So
thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. All right, anything else? Or okay. All right. I'm just staring at this this little owl. Okay, looking into the void there. All right. So click all the way back through. Okay, so now let me get to the clique stuff. Okay, and now so I have a colleague, Carson Chow, and he says there's two easy cases. Okay, 2 and infinity. And everything in between is hard, okay? So now I'm gonna do infinity, okay? And we'll see what we can learn in that case. So in this case, we have a clique, okay, of individuals making binary decisions. And this might be, a big room, of some political council voting, maybe it's a faculty meeting, maybe it's, animals vocalizing that can sort of all hear each other. We have some sort of completely connected network architecture where everybody sort of sees each other's decision or indecision. Okay, and what I'll show in this case is sort of how the decision of one individual propagates through the entire group, and waves of the group can sort of make corrections based on what they see waves before them of decisions do. Okay, and so it's not quite the lessons that we maybe got out of like herding models in the past, because we're trying to do this kind of a Bayesian honest way. Okay, so in this case, we have a large clique. It turns out the operative agent in this case is the one that makes the first decision. That's going to trigger off this interesting sort of stochastic dynamical process. We'll assume that all the agents to start with, they have symmetric thresholds, okay, but maybe heterogeneous, okay, and you know, some agents down the road will have different symmetric thresholds. Well, we'll start off with the case where all agents have the same threshold plus theta or minus theta to decide, you know, whether the plus or the minus decision is true. We have some large n number of agents, so we can do some cute asymptotics. All agents can see each other, okay? And we're in the continuum limit, so they're all sort of individually accumulating information according to this drift-diffusion process, okay? So this is one of those agents equations, and let's say in this case, the underlying truth is that the plus decision is true. So the drift is in the positive direction, and so their, you know, sort of belief trajectory kind of looks like this, okay, maybe. And at some point, there's some other agent that makes a decision, and they sort of share their belief with that agent, okay? So we'll assume without loss of generality that the plus decision is correct, as I said. Each of the agents receives sort of an independent sample of the underlying evidence, okay? So they don't all have trajectories that look exactly the same, and you sort of copy and pasting those there, and they can all see each other's beliefs, okay? And the key moment is when the first decision is made, and at that point, okay, all of the yet undecided agents get their beliefs kicked by some amount, plus theta or minus theta. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. You said this was like a continuous model. Is that they are observing evidence continuously, or observing other people continuously? Or
Yeah, they're observing evidence continuously, and they're so basically as it's just in continuous time rather than a discrete time update. So we're sort of passing to the continuum limit so that we can more easily do some first passage time calculations. So, yes. Okay, so at some point, one of these agents makes a decision, okay? And before that time, no social information is passed because we're going to assume they have symmetric thresholds, okay? So they don't do this thing of looking over at their neighbors and saying, oh, well, you're undecided still, so I get some information from that. Because their neighbors' thresholds are symmetric, they actually get no information from their neighbors, okay? And this was really a mathematical convenience, because otherwise it was sort of a nightmare to do it if we introduced asymmetries to start with, okay? Except for maybe through simulations, okay? So what happens after that first decision? Well, agent one makes some decision at some time t, okay? Let's assume that it's h plus for now, okay? All of the agents are then going to update their belief by this amount theta. So they're all going to have their belief kicked by some amount theta, okay? And all the agents for which their belief lives between 0 and theta at that point, they get kicked over threshold. So they end up agreeing with the first agent. Now there's another group of agent, there's n minus a1 minus 1 of them, whose belief lives between minus theta and 0, and they get kicked by that amount too, but that's not enough to kick them above threshold. So they look around and say, we all disagree, okay, with the individual that made that first decision. And then they can get information based on knowing that these agents agreed, and then some, group of them also disagree, okay? So there's the blue undecided and the green decided agents, okay? And because they don't know exactly what each other's beliefs were, but just that, where those beliefs possibly lived, they get some amount of information, we'll call it R plus and R minus from each of those agreeing and disagreeing agents, okay? And I won't write out the formula for this, but it's basically the log likelihood ratio of the integral over the possible positions. It's basically the log likelihood ratio associated with being, in this region or in this region, depending on whether the plus or the minus decision is actually true. Okay. And if you add all this up, you get some increment now that you add to the undecided agents. And if that's positive, it pushes all the undecided agents' beliefs in the positive direction. If it's negative, it pushes that in the negative direction. And if it's big enough, then all of the undecided agents make a decision at that point in time. Yes.
So that increment or decrement is uniform across the undecided agents.
That's right. Yeah, because you have just symmetry in this group.
Gotcha.
So again, let's recap. Okay, one agent makes a decision that triggers a bunch of agents to agree with them, and then there's some second wave of possibly agreeing or disagreeing agents that then make a subsequent decision, and then more waves can follow after that. Okay, depending on whether the remaining agents then get information. Okay, so we can do some cute asymptotics to identify the time to first decision, and the limit as n gets large. And we can show in this limit actually that all of the agents make a decision in the second wave. Okay, when there's enough agents, basically there's going to be enough of a differential on average between the number of agreeing and disagreeing agents that you're going to get either a big kick in the positive direction or a big kick in the negative direction, and then you're done. Okay, the whole group's decided. Okay, so it turns out we got a scaling law for the mean time of this first decision. Not surprisingly, it goes up with the threshold. The farther away the threshold is, the longer the state. And it goes down as one over the log of the number of agents. Okay, so the more agents there are, the quicker you get a first decision. And we can work this out using something called order statistics. And I think it's like the Gompertz law or something like that. Okay. Okay, so what we like to know is what happens in this large n limit. Okay, well, on average, the mean number of agreeing agents is going to go up sort of sublinearly with the total number of agents. Okay, and if we work out what the belief update is, okay, the belief update goes up like n divided by log over n. So because n goes up bigger, it's faster than log n does. In the limit of large n, this belief increment gets huge. And the interesting thing is that whether the first decision was the plus decision or whether it's a minus decision, this belief update is always positive. Okay, so what that tells us is that the second group is always sort of self-correcting. So sort of the Bayesian rationality wins out. Even if the first agent screws up and makes the wrong decision and has a bunch of individuals follow them, there will actually, on average, be more undecided agents in that case, and they'll all make the correct decision. Okay, this is sort of, Bayesian wisdom of the crowds, if you like. Okay, which of course we know doesn't happen for people. Okay, all the time, but it bears out in this model. Okay, so if the network's sufficiently large, then this number is surely going to be bigger than 2 theta, and we showed that it happens as the clique size gets large. So as soon as you have like 10,000 agents, pretty much the whole clique decides in 2 ways. Okay, so and it's a self-correcting sort of second wave. Okay, so now finally to the punchline. Okay, that's in the case of a homogeneous distribution of thresholds. But what about if you've got a couple different kinds of agents? Okay, so let's say you have some agents that are like impulsive or hasty. Okay, they don't need very much information at all to make a decision. Their thresholds are very close together. Okay, they just need a little bit of information and they'll make a decision. And then you have maybe some more deliberate agents that are going to take a lot longer to arrive at a decision. Okay, well, in this case, the first decision is probably going to be made by an impulsive agent because it's way easier to get to a closed threshold than a far threshold. You can work that out with large deviations theory. And as long as this fraction of impulsive agents isn't too small, then the time to that first decision is going to scale like this. So sort of the 1 over the log of gamma times that. Okay. So in that case, okay, if we assume that all agents know their group mates threshold, which of course can be true for Bayesian agents, okay, of course this is majorly problematic for people that may or may not know their neighbors' decision thresholds. In that case, the impulsive agents sort of hijack the decision, okay? And the deliberate agents look at the impulsive agents. If they don't know that they're impulsive, they may think that they're deliberate and overvalue their decisions, okay? So this, again, another conceptual lesson to come out of these models, okay, that improperly weighting the value of your neighbor's decisions, okay, can lead to these sort of deleterious pathological sort of herding type behaviors. But if you properly weight, okay, the value of your neighbor's decision, then you can really harness some useful information from that and prevent yourself from being sort of swayed by the whims of the hasty and impulsive. So let's see what happens if, you know, we do assume that they can all know each other's thresholds. In that case, the hasty agents, okay, they make the first decision and they basically comprise the first wave. About half of them join the first wave. It turns out in this case, you can tune that fraction as well as the hasty agent's decision threshold to be just large enough to trigger a second wave, but small enough to prevent some of the more deliberate agents from following a wrong first decision, okay? So if you remember sort of what happened in the homogeneous group, you actually got, you know, something like a little bit more than half of the agents making a correct decision, okay? But in this case, you can get way more than half of the agents to make a correct decision. Because really just the hasty agents, some of the hasty agents make a wrong first decision. But you can actually get most of your deliberate agents to make the right decision by sort of tuning things just right, okay? So it's sort of a Goldilocks situation, okay? So if you have too few, okay, hasty agents, then you don't really get enough information to trigger decisions in the deliberate group. If you have too many hasty agents, then you get a lot of agents that make sort of a wrong decision. But you know, if you just have just the right balance of hasty agents, you just get a few of them that that make a wrong decision, and then the rest of the agents sort of learn from this by looking around and investigating the, you know, the undecided agents, and they all adopt sort of the correct decision in this case. And it turns out, in order to balance this just right, that increment, which we can work out, that the second wave gets, needs to be equal to twice the threshold of the deliberate agents, okay? And we can work out sort of a back of the envelope estimate for how big of a fraction of hasty agents you need, okay? So in this case, this heat map is just Sims, and we show that you can maximize sort of the number of accurate agents or the fraction of accurate agents, okay? By having the hasty agents have a threshold that's about half of that of the deliberate agents, okay? And actually a fairly small fraction of hasty agents, something like 2 or 3%, okay? So if you just have a few sort of hasty, sort of trigger happy agents, okay, they can provide enough evidence to the rest of the agents. They can sort of sniff out what's true and what's not, and the rest of the deliberate agents can profit from that, okay? Yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So the hastier they are, the more hasty agents I need to be in that right threshold. Is that right?
Yeah, so as they get hastier, the higher a fraction you need to be in that group. Yeah, because each agent gives successively less and less information, right? Because their LLR increment is smaller and smaller. Yeah, that's where you get this sort of inverse relationship. Yeah, any other questions? Okay, so that's basically the punchline, and it's in this paper, and we did a few more cases as well, but essentially we found that these dichotomous groups where you have hasty and deliberate agents, okay, you can sort of tune them to maximize the fraction of accurate agents relative to the total number of agents, and you do much better than homogeneous groups. We also did this in groups with sort of uniformly distributed thresholds as well, and we found something similar. So it's not particular to sort of dichotomous distributions, but that case was easier to analyze. And so, in this case, we were able to get a lot of nice sort of formulas that helped us understand what's going on. But of course, we could break a lot of the sort of strong assumptions that we made in this, and search this space, I think, with Sims to see that this is fairly robust. Okay. So I think that's probably maybe enough. I could go on to other stuff, but I think I've been going for almost an hour. So I'll just sort of sum up this part. So so for large cliques, right, I said the whole group decides after 2 waves. And in particular, in this case of sort of dichotomously distributed thresholds, what you find is that really just having a small fraction of hasty agents allows the more deliberate agents to learn from their wrong or right decisions and make an accurate, large majority decision with the entire group. Okay. All right. So I think I'll stop there. I think I only have till like 10 till minutes. So
Well, we have about 15 minutes, which
okay.
should probably be plenty for discussion. So
Okay. All right.
maybe I would suggest doing that.
Yeah. So I'll just stop there and yeah, and happy to discuss and take questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much.